Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for tuning in. My name is Anna Sabino, and I'm here with my colleague, Emily Cook. For those of you who are not familiar, the College Diabetes Network is a nonprofit organization. We are, although based in Boston, all remotely as of several weeks ago. We are a peer network organization really focused on improving the lives of young adults living with T1D by providing them resources and programming to make their transition to adulthood really less daunting. We have networks, our chapter network, we work very closely with higher ed institutions, our clinical programs, really to kind of bridge that gap. And today we are very thankful to be here with Margaret Camp, who is a representative from our campus advisory committee. Thank you, Margaret. And Margaret's really going to be talking with us about what life has been like since students have transitioned to remote learning and adjusting to accommodations living at home in this brand new environment. So Margaret, I'll let you introduce yourself and really kind of give us an update. How are things going in the last several weeks since everything's really shifted so drastically?
Sure. Thanks, Anna. I'm Margaret, and I'm the Director of Student Accessibility Services at Clemson. I've been at Clemson for about 5 years. Prior, I was 10 years at University of South Carolina Upstate, and I was at UNC Chapel Hill before that. And so it's a pretty long career thus far, but I've never seen anything like what we're going through right now with the COVID virus and this extremely quick move and shift and having to kind of pivot and flex the way that we're having to right now, that all institutions of higher learning are having to do. And so we're feeling our way through it. And we're looking for our partners and our collaborators, and certainly College Diabetes Network is one of those. So we're glad to have those connections. Right now, what we're seeing, I think we saw a lot of panic in the beginning, and the onus was really on our faculty to create their courses in an online format that would be as accessible and digestible for these unsuspecting students as possible. That's starting to calm down some, and we're seeing fewer concerns and questions and more just kind of feeling our way through it. So one of the things that we've seen is the need to almost go back to the intake process for some of our students with accommodations and look at it from a different perspective. Depending on how the courses have shifted and how much change there is, and that's largely up to each professor, there are likely some institutions that tried to keep things consistent in terms of whether courses would be offered in real time at their usual course time, or whether they might be recorded and put up for students in that way. I know at Clemson, it's largely been up to the professor how they want to translate their course into online learning, which means that a student who has 4 or 5 classes may now have classes in very different formats, and they're not even similar to each other. But feeling our way through that, but going back and really asking the students, what are you experiencing? What are you stressing out about? What are your needs during this time? And how can we make it more palatable for you and advocate for you? And so we're finding that some students are doing okay parlaying their accommodations into the online format. Some students are having more concerns and more difficulties, and we're trying to work with those. Some of what we're seeing is, you know, especially with chronic illness, we know that it's greatly exacerbated by stress. And I think that everyone is stressed right now, including faculty, including staff, including all of us, parents, students, and that stress is hitting people in different ways, and we're all responding differently. But we are seeing some students who are having a lot more physical illness problems because of the stress level. And it's not just about the classes. Students have family members who may be having employment difficulties. A lot of people are getting laid off, they may have family members who are sick with the virus. I know some specifically who have been dealing with that. And so the stress that we hear about the classes may not be just about the classes and the switch to online learning. There's just a lot of things that people are dealing with right now. And so we try to ask our faculty and our staff to keep in mind that the stress we're hearing from students may not be all about the class, but the class is what they've got to focus on, and the class is where we need to try to apply some flexibility. So we're seeing the increased stress levels, which of course exacerbate the chronic physical illnesses. We're seeing a lot of questions about how medical and absence accommodations translate into an online environment. And that has to be a fairly customized discussion with the student and with the professor to determine where the student's functioning is and the impact on it, and to talk to the professor about the design and layout of their course that has now changed and may still be in flux. We're seeing that some too, that what professors put in place 2 weeks ago, they're finding didn't work, and they're making changes, which means that we all have to adapt again to something different. Another thing that we're seeing a whole lot of is the need for testing accommodations to shift, with looking at some virtual remote proctoring or some automated remote proctoring. These are things that a lot of faculty aren't familiar with and a lot of students aren't familiar with. So trying to navigate those accommodations, especially with chronic illnesses, it has been a challenge. Those are just some of the things that we're seeing right now.
Margaret, I don't envy your position, and you are a dream come true, I'm sure, for a lot of students and faculty that you work with, because I know that you're so dedicated to making sure that, you know, anyone living with the need that or the reason that they need to have accommodations in place to succeed in school is wonderful. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing to help these students. I think we're all kind of scrambling to make sure that everybody can move forward despite the obvious. You mentioned testing accommodations. I think as we're approaching, you know, the end of the spring semester, you had mentioned earlier in a recent call we had about, you know, a pass fail, or can you talk a little bit about what some additional struggles and challenges and patterns you're seeing, especially with college seniors? I think there's a lot of worry and fear that, you know, especially students that have, you know, additional degrees they're trying to pursue. You know, what does that look like, and what advice would you have for, you know, students with something like diabetes? How do they move forward with that?
Right, sure. We are seeing some truly unprecedented policy modifications and changes, and a lot of those are being driven by students. I know at Clemson, our student government had a very loud voice in that led to some policy modifications. Several institutions have gone to pass-fail classes across the board for the rest of the semester. Clemson did something that's a little different. There are 3 different options: credit with no grade, pass-fail. It's pretty involved, but the reason that they went that route is because there are effects of that may happen down the line, or that students may not be thinking about. Effects on scholarships, effects on graduate school applications, effects on prerequisite classes and what will be accepted and won't be accepted, things like effects on transferring, if you're looking at transferring to another university. So the way that Clemson has set it up is that for students to access any of those modifications, which are available to them, but their advisor has to approve it first. And so they need to be in communication with their advisor, and their advisor will help walk them through and make sure they understand, if you do this option, this is how it could affect these things, so that the student can then make a very informed decision. Another thing that we're seeing is institutions trying to cut down some on the amount of testing and the final exams. I know for Clemson, all students will have the opportunity at the end of the semester, they will be told what their grade is in the class, and they have the opportunity to accept that grade without taking the final. And that's fairly across the board. It was recommended by the provost. There are some classes that can't do that for specific reasons, but that gives the student an option to not have to worry about the final exam, and to just take their grade at that point, which we're hoping is going to help us with some of these concerns that we have about the comprehensive final and things like that. So, but that's what we're seeing across a lot of campuses is policy modifications. And it's very important for students to be in communication with their professors and with their advisors, and to understand how they can benefit from those modifications, how those modifications can hopefully help them deal with some of the stress and transition, and just kind of give them some flexibility, but also what the implications of them are, so that they don't get 2 semesters down the road or beyond graduation, or, and say, well, I didn't understand that it was going to affect me in this way. So I think communicating, leaning on the resources that are there for students is very important right now.
Absolutely. I think communication, regardless of what that format looks like now, is even more important. So knowing that this is such a different environment for, current students and even future enrolling students, can you change or update your accommodations at any time, especially now that the learning environment has completely changed? Is that something that can be updated? And what does that process look like generally? I'm sure it's different at every institution specifically, but is that something that is usually easily done?
It should be, yes, especially in a situation like this where so much has changed. The entire design of courses and of testing has changed. And so typically, certainly on our campus, the student reaches out to our office and lets us know, hey, I'm working with this situation. I feel like the accommodations that I have are no longer enough, or are no longer pertain to the situation, or I really need some help thinking outside the box on this one. And so then what we would do, if we can work with the student through emails, that tends to be the easiest thing, and we're willing to do that. But we are happy to set up a virtual appointment with the student and have what we call a follow-up meeting to talk about it. And sometimes that's just better for students to have that sort of face-to-face, or we'll do a phone appointment. They might say, this is just too much for me to type in an email, or I just really need to talk to someone and sort of talk it through. We're happy to do that. And we've also been fielding some concerns from parents. And while we want the student to be involved, we will certainly allow the parent to be involved and indicate what their concerns are. And so a lot of students are with their parents during this time, and that's a little convenient because we can have a meeting with both and kind of walk through all of that together. But yes, definitely, I would say wherever a student is, it is very likely that the thing to do would be to reach out to Student Accessibility Services or the Disability Resource Center, whatever it's called. Whatever office you receive your accommodations through, reach out to that office and say, hey, I'd like to talk about my accommodations, particularly with this big transition, and make sure that I have some equal access to classes.
That's really good to hear. across the board. And obviously we're thinking about, summer classes and potentially the fall, and, semester ahead is, I'm sure, where everyone's thoughts are in terms of admissions. Right now we're approaching May 1st, which traditionally is the, decision deadline for a lot of high school seniors. What are you, well, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Emily to kind of talk about, what we're seeing in terms of, advice and options for high school seniors, as I'm sure, especially parents are really concerned about what this environment could look like for, incoming freshmen or just returning students to campus.
Sure. And something that is kind of sad and certainly feels like a loss here for incoming, for high school seniors, is that you cannot go to campus and take a tour. And all of the freshman welcome days and things like that, and orientations. I know at Clemson, orientation is being moved online, and then phase 1 will be online, and then students will come 4 or 5 days early in the fall for an orientation, for an on-site orientation. But we have to go ahead and get them registered for their fall classes, and so that's why we have the online orientation over the summer. So a lot of times students will come to campus, maybe they're making that final decision about which school they're going to attend, or maybe they've made the decision and they're coming to visit or to do another tour. And a lot of times they will stop by our office for information and to say hello and introduce themselves. And so we are sad that that's not possible right now, and that the campus is effectively closed to incoming students. So we do feel that loss. And sadly, we're not able to set up meetings with prospective students to talk about what accommodations might be, because right now we are pretty overwhelmed with helping our currently matriculated students. So I think it's very likely that across the board institutions feel that way, that, that we're trying to help students get through this, and we're unable to spend a lot of time with very specific discussions with prospective students. However, we are happy to answer general questions. And if folks call our office or email our office and want to know, what does this look like in college compared to high school, or what would you need in terms of documentation, those sorts of things, we're happy to answer. And a lot of that can be found on websites as well, especially under prospective students or incoming freshmen. So mining what's on the web at different institutions for information about that could be a first step. And then I think all offices are willing to at least talk about, even if they're unable to get into very, very involved discussions right now. We're excited about our prospective students, and we want to be welcoming to them, but it is a difficult time to have personnel so engaged in trying to get the students who are already matriculated through this semester, that it does take away some from the incoming students' experience. I'm trying to think what else. Oh, however, it is very important for students who are incoming freshmen, while they may not have an accommodation meeting during the summer, it is really important, if you need housing accommodations, to go ahead and start talking to either the Disability Services Office or the Housing Office. And housing is likely going to send you to whatever office works with housing accommodations. It could be housing, it could be disability or accessibility services. I know that's what we have, a person in our office who does all of our housing accommodations, and she is slam busy right now with incoming students and having virtual meetings with them. So while the academic accommodations are not necessarily addressed yet, and for one thing, it's really better to do that after you have registered and you have your schedule, we're much better able to speak to what those courses are going to look like and what your course load is going to feel like once you've registered. But but the housing accommodations are really important to go ahead and start talking about, and get those in place, because housing does fill up so quickly. And there's a lot of information about, there's a lot of things to think about with housing. And I think that is on most people's radar. And for us, bundled within housing is also dining. And dining accommodations tend to be a big one for students with chronic illnesses and for students with diabetes in particular. So looking at housing that is situated close to the best dining hall to meet your needs. I know at Clemson, we have one dining hall in particular that focuses on and specializes in food allergies, food sensitivities, sugar-free, etc. And so that's probably the better dining hall to live near. And so, you know, finding out things like that, finding out, we have some residence halls at Clemson that are 2-story that don't have elevators. So, you know, finding out things like that, finding out, is there room for a second refrigerator for insulin? Is there, are the beds lofted in this residence hall? That might not be a good idea for someone who could wake up with low blood sugar and need to get out of bed quickly. I mean, just some of those things that you might not be thinking about, that working with, going ahead and working with an office like mine can get those questions flowing and make sure you get in the best housing situation.
So I guess along a few of those same lines, just in terms of accommodations in general that people with diabetes might be looking into as they're looking into enrolling in their schools for the coming fall semester. What are some other accommodations, or kind of like you said, these might be things that people aren't really necessarily thinking about even, and it's hard to kind of refocus and rethink about these other pieces on top of making a decision for admissions, just thinking about all of these other things that you may have to put in place in order to ensure success in general. So I guess, seeing as your background, and you've probably seen quite a few different accommodations, what are, I guess, some of the ones that stick out to you?
Sure. So in addition to the academic accommodations, which people do tend to think of, the housing accommodations are big, and the dining accommodations. In addition, possibly transportation accommodations and what that looks like on campus. At Clemson, we have a very sprawling, leggy campus. And so being very aware of where classes are located, and whether or not you might be able to make it between classes in 15 minutes on an extremely hot, humid day, or in the cold. It doesn't get cold like it does in some areas, but kind of looking at what might be available, and proximity to different things, that's a consideration. Definitely some of the things that come to mind are the refrigerator for additional space for insulin, or to have a refrigerator that is sort of not contaminated by food, but is just a medication refrigerator. Space for supplies, if a student needs that. Does the university provide sharps containers? At Clemson, we do, and students just take them to health services and drop them off and get an empty one, and they take care of any kind of hazardous waste. Oh, I just thought of something and then it went out of my brain. Bathroom needs. Are there specific bathroom needs or bathroom preferences? And looking at which residence halls provide different types of arrangements and situations. Is a community bathroom better? Is a private bathroom better? Is a shared but only with a few people better? Do you need a sink in your room? You know, those sorts of things, thinking through those questions. And then consideration for any type of device that you might use. And so we see a lot of continuous glucose monitors lately, and we see a lot of monitoring through cell phones and apps on cell phones. So thinking about how that's going to work with being in class, how is that going to work with testing? That's one of the things we've run into with some of the remote proctoring, is that there's actually a program that a lot of schools are using that flags, it's recording students testing, and it flags if the student makes a lot of movement and activity and takes their eyes away from the computer screen for a period of time. So it doesn't penalize them necessarily, but it flags that for follow-up. Well, if a student needs to pay attention to their device to look at their blood sugar levels or to look at something like that, that's going to flag them. That's going to be something that the professor might say, well, wait, why are you looking away from the screen? Why are you looking at your cell phone while you're taking a test? You know, those are things that we want to take into consideration and get out as an accommodation up front, if possible, so that there's not a question of whether the student's cheating. But just thinking about, you know, insulin pumps, just different devices and what sorts of accommodations that might lead to. Trying to think what else. You know, even the accommodations to do things like the ability to leave class and return, you know, quietly without penalty. That's something that a lot of times students need to go out and take care of, some need that's based on their chronic illness. I mean, you guys know a lot of that. What am I forgetting? What might be helpful to people that I'm not thinking of?
No, I think those cover quite a bit of the ones that we were thinking of on our end, at least, plus some that I didn't necessarily have at the top of my mind. I guess one of the final things that I wanted to ask you, and you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, as you mentioned, a lot of your concerted efforts have been concerned with your current student body and serving your students' needs currently at Clemson. What piece of advice would you give to incoming students as well as their parents just as they're heading into this fall semester of 2020?
And I know that a lot of students and parents have concerns, and the transition from high school to college just in itself is a big one. And this is throwing further kinks into that. But I think it's important for folks to realize that equal access should be equal access and should look the same across campuses. And while there may be some differences in protocol or processes, typically policies are roughly the same. And so what we have found in the last few years is that a lot of parents and students who are prospective are contacting our office and saying, if I come to your campus, can you guarantee that I'll have this? Can you guarantee I'll have an emotional support animal? Or can you guarantee that I'll have a single room with my own bathroom, or something like that? And we are not in the practice of making those guarantees prior to matriculation, prior to knowing that a student is coming to us, and really getting into what their specific customized needs are. And I think a lot of other campuses feel the same way. And I know that's frustrating because it's a big decision where you go to college, but it really should look the same. If it's a need that the student has for equal access, it should be a need no matter what campus you end up at. And the campus should be working to meet that need. And so I think if maybe that can help parents and students relax a little bit and know that it's not the case that I'm going to choose a university that's not going to give me accommodations. I think it just might look a little different. The language might look a little different and the processes might look a little different, but we have national listservs where we all discuss our best practices. And I think that ultimately it should look very similar. And I thought of another thing when you asked that. I think that it's important too for parents and students to know that there's support on college campuses. College Diabetes Network is a great example, and it's one that I use a lot because it is so organized and so consistent. And campuses that have CDN chapters that's a really great resource. I hand out your booklets all the time. But sometimes I know for our office, if a student would like to be connected to for example, if they have type 1 diabetes and they'd like to be connected with an existing student who has type 1 diabetes, we can arrange for that. Someone that they can ask questions of. And then we can arrange parents with parents. We have parents who will volunteer and say, oh, I'd be happy to talk about the concerns we had through this process and how they were handled and the questions we didn't think to ask and things like that. So I think definitely asking at an institution, can you connect me with someone? CDN is absolutely there, but there are a lot of different types of chronic illnesses that, don't have that type of strong organization behind them. But if you can be connected with just one family or one student who can answer some of those questions, I think that's helpful. It's always helpful to talk with someone about their experience and just not have to navigate it straight from scratch, build on what they learned.
I completely agree. And I think it's so great that, one of the silver linings of all of this is that, we're all in this together. Universities, staff, students, parents, everybody is trying to navigate what this looks like. And it's really day by day at this point. So, I know you talked a little bit about how you feel the value of our CDN resources are. Margaret spoke a little bit to our chapter network. Not every university and institution has a chapter. Any student on campus who is living with or affected by diabetes is welcome to start a chapter. We don't know yet what that looks like virtually, but more than willing to speak with anyone who wants to learn more about our network. But Emily's going to pull up, share her screen and pull up the link to some of our resources they're free, they're digital, that Margaret was referencing. We have off to college guides. We have newly diagnosed guides for those who have just recently been diagnosed with diabetes and are heading off to school or are in school. And we have our off to work guide because we also know that the transition, especially for college seniors and those that now have disrupted summer employment, transitioning to, what work will look like differently in these coming months. Our resources are listed on this website. They're completely free. You just have to request a copy. And again, I want to just thank you, Margaret, for taking the opportunity to talk with us. I think a lot of times we don't necessarily hear from the campus side of what this looks like. I think a lot of parents and students are very fearful of, regardless of this current situation, obviously sending a child off to school. So thank you so much for providing this insight. Is there anything else you would add to either for current students or, incoming parents, in terms of right now where they can go or turn or general advice you would offer them?
The one other thing that I thought of, and I know that CDN has a resource on this, or this is embedded in one of the resources, is the decision about when you will transfer to an adult endocrinologist as opposed to a pediatric endocrinologist. And I don't see a right answer there. I see that people have found value in lots of different paths, but I think starting to ask that question of right now, do we stick with what we know and someone who's been helpful to us for a long time and knows us well, or is it time to start looking at that transition and looking at someone who can work with these more adult related issues? And I know that I've seen a resource that CDN has to help guide students through that, but that's another sort of transitional piece.
It is. Everything's in transition, and with a lot more kind of virtual visits in healthcare situations, that's going to become I think, a lot more popular for students. So I also wanted to let everyone know that we will be having additional guides available later this year, specific to accessibility and disability services. We also have a health services guide available on that resource hub that Emily just showed you. So thank you all so much for joining and tuning in. We will be offering several more of these Q&A sessions, and please feel free to visit our website, join as a member. And again, thank you, Margaret, so much, and good luck with the rest of this semester anyway, navigating these challenging times.
Thank you. It's always good to talk with you all.